So tomorrow I'm leaving to Chutz La'aretz, and today we will be discussing the controversy about the Esrogim Murkovim. I was just looking for a Mishnah Berurah which I did not find, and if I wouldn't be leaving to Chutz La'aretz tomorrow, maybe I would take another day to achieve greater clarity in this complicated sugya. But bearing in mind that I'm leaving tomorrow and I live to Mechaveri Ali Poter, so I take this opportunity. Esrog HaMoorkav, and this is a controversy that goes back approximately 500 years, and the first Shuvas that we find are Shuvas Haramosim Kuf Chavav. And in this Shuvah we don't know anything about the opinion of the Ramo. We only know the son of Maram Padova relates to this question. Shuvas Maram Al-Shech, Siman Kuf Yud, and Shuvas Abach, in which we find the big machlokes between the Bach and the Sma. And the Bach and the Sma correspond quite a lot. The Sma was a Talmud of the Ramo, the Bach was a Talmud of the Marshal, and so these are the early sources. Shuvas Abach, Maram Al-Shech, and Shuvas Ramo, quoting a Shuvah from Maram Padova. And the Al-Shech testifies all the Gedolim of Tzvas, all my predecessors, and those were the greatest Gedolim of that Kufa, the Mabit and the Marit and the Beis Yosef and many others, ruled that an Esrog Murkav is possible, totally possible, and even B'Shas Chag you can't make a bracha even if you have no others, and that is the opinion of Maram Padova as quoted in Shuvas Haramosim and Kuf Chav Vav. The Bach was Machshar and Esrog Murkav, and the Sma corresponds with the Bach Sima Kuf Lamed Hey and Kuf Lamed Vav. Kuf Lamed Hey is the Jew of the Sma, responding against the Hechsher of the Bach. Kuf Lamed Vav, that a Bach is Oimed al Da'atoi, but he does right. I agree that Lachatchila one should not take an Esrog Murkav, but if there are no other Esrogim, then one could take an Esrog Murkav without a bracha. But the Bach's fundamental opinion was Lahachshir Esrog HaMurkav. Mishnah Berurah Tov Reish Mem Ches Siv Kotten Samech Hey. We have an Arichas Gedoylo, and I think that in Tov Reish Mem Tes there's another Mishnah Berurah, but I did not find it right now. I was looking for it. Tov Reish Mem Ches Siv Kotten Samech Hey. An Arichas Gedoylo in the Mishnah Berurah, and he brings the opinions that Pasal and Esrog Murkav. He brings both opinions regarding a situation in which you don't have any other Esrogim. Those that say you should take it without a bracha, those that say don't take it at all, dilma osel misrach, and he doesn't agree between them. As many times in the Mishnah Berurah, not always in speaks to the opinions, he is machriya which of them is right. And at the end of Sif Kotten Samachay, which is a very lengthy Sif Kotten, da sheskim achroinim, the yesh la'achmil inyan Esrog Murkav afilu b'shah yomim, v'em ein loy achar be'iyar. Yes, little called Shiva beloy brocha. V'yesh machmirim afilu little beloy brocha. Gam kein ein kedai. Dilma osel misrach. Let's say boy Tommy. And towards the second part of today's shiur, we will deal with Hadasim Mirkovim, which is a tshuva in Shvus Yankev Chelek Aleph Siman Lamed Vav, a very interesting tshuva. But let us first talk about Esrog HaMurkav. What is the reasoning to pass an Esrog HaMurkav? If it looks like an Esrog, smells like an Esrog, tastes like an Esrog, why would an Esrog HaMurkav be possible? And so Mechroidim, primarily the Al-Shech, which is one of the three early sources, the Al-Shech says maybe there's a difference between two types of Murkavim. If you take a twig or a branch of an Esrog tree and you plant it into a lemon tree, that might be more reasoning to be Machshir, because after all, this branch is from an Esrog tree, and therefore whatever fruit grows on this branch would be an Esrog. But if you take a twig or a branch of a lemon tree and you mark it into a Esrog tree, then there's more reason to pasal. But most of the great poskim do not differentiate, and they say every murkav is posel. What are the reasons to pasal? Okay, so Tovresh Memtes, in the Seif in which the Mechaber deals with Shas Chak. Shas Chak, Kosher Chanoch, B'Shas Chak, She'enim Tzekosha, כל הפסולה נוטלה ויהיה מבורכן, ויש מכשירים לו לבריובש. I do not recall whether we spoke about this. Gewaltige Yiddish. Yes, machine even for a brocha. But that is not today's shiur. That is a very fundamental shiur that we'll talk about some other time. I do think in the past, maybe in earlier kuvatzot, we spoke about it. So the Mechaba says, B'shas adchak, beli brocha. Mishnah Berurah Sivkot Nun Gimel writes, Hainu psulen machmas mun. אבל הפסולה מחמס שאינן מינן, כגון, עוד השויטה וצפצפו אוי מורכב פוסול, אפילו בשעת הדחק. ועושה למיטל אצייס בהם תמיד. So, the Mishnah Berurah, Talmach, Sivkot Samachay is not Machriya, he brings both days. Here, Tofresh Memtes, Nun Gimel, he writes, an Esrog Murkav is not an Esrog at all, and even B'shas Adchak, you can't take it because it's 100% puzzle. So that is one of the reasons to pass on an Esrog Murkav. It is not defined as an Esrog. And that is the Mogen Avraham. Tofresh Memches, Sivkot Nechov Gimel, the Mogen Avraham says, Esrog Murkav is not an Esrog at all, and the Mishnah Berurah quotes him in both sources, Tofresh Memches Samachet, Tofresh Memtes Nun Gimel. Tofresh Memtes Nun Gimel is more adamant, and he says even b'shas adchak, you don't take an Esrog Murkav. And Tofresh Memches, he brings two different opinions. The Levush. And the Levush says that the reason to pass an Esrog Murkav is mishum shenavdol bo aveiro. And most of the Achronim reject the Levush, Barichas Gedolah, that has a few reasons and a few kashas on the Levush. We won't go into this Barichas. But the Levush says, Kivin Shabo al Yidei Aveira, and that is why Posel. And even if a goy did the Harkova, Yesho Imrim, Shegoyim Nistabu al Harbos Aklayim. And the Taz says, but that is not halacha. So the Levush says the reason Esrog Murkav is Posel, Mishum Shelev de Aveira, and that is rejected by many, many other poskim. Chazon Ish, both in Hilchas Klayim, and in Siman Kuf Nun Vav, which is on Seder Alochas and Dalet Minim, Orochaim Kuf Nun Vav, the Chazon Ish says, even though in Issa Klayim, a lemon and Esrog would be considered the same species, and there might not be an Issa Klayim at all, but regarding Esrog Murkav is possible. So the Chazon Ish also goes against the Levush. Shuvos Yankiv argues that in Esrog and Lemon, because in Hilchas Klayim there is no Isa of Kalayim, maybe that is a reason to Mimaksha Esrog Murkav. So the Shuvos Yankiv maintains that the definition of a Murkav is only when it's Shnei Minim Lagabi Kalayim. And the Chazon Ish says there are three different areas in Halacha in which it is relevant to determine whether different species are considered two different minim or they might be considered the same. And that is Kila'ayim. Because there's an Isra Laharka Min Be'enoi Minoi Tumasamaisis. Afilu B'di'evet Hamafresh Mamin Al Min Acher Ein Trumosoi Truma. Hamafresh Min Aro Al Yofo is just an Isra Lachet Chever B'di'evet Trumosoi Truma. But when you mafresh one mean and the other even B'di'evet Ein Trumosoi Truma, and the Chazon Ish says, when we're dealing with an Esrog Murkav, even though you're markev two citrus fruits, in Lagabi climate would not be in a climate. Lagabi Tumasamaisis, you could be mafresh Mezel Zeh. Regarding Esrog, it is different because Esrog is the Mitzodis. Pri'et Sodar is exactly, we don't find anywhere that we find by Machzas HaShekel and the Menorah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Oitzi Matbei HaShalei Sheli showed Moshe Rabbeinu Kazeira Eva Kadosh. We find that by the Menorah, Machzas HaShekel and Kiddush Levana. We don't find that by Esrog, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu. This is the Esrog. However, the Chazon Ish argues it is totally b'Mesoides, and the Esrog is exactly what the Esrog was 3,000 years ago, and therefore Esrog Murkav is possible, even though the Harkova is two minim. Regarding Hilchas Klayim, there would be no Issa. Regarding Afroshas Tumas Amaisis, you could be Mafresh Mezel Zeh. Regarding the din of Esrog Murkav, it would be possible.
I have a by Yana Esrog.
Really? Probably he means a metaphor. I don't think he brings a medrash.
He says it's.
I think it's medrash.
I think he says the word. I thought the way my Vatsker said. He said.
So HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed Moshe Rabbeinu a Yanav Esrig.
Yes.
I don't know whether the Yanav was existent in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. Is it a metaphor? Does he bring a medrash? I don't know.
Basically, if you bring the Pirush Mishnayos, in Adam Pirush Mishnayos, the Rambam brings as a dogma that the Roshas of Chazal is not because they had big books. Whereas I have in the Parush of Riemann, there was no real no suffix. That it was whatever that.
Yes. So the Rambam writes that in Perush Mishnah and Periklu Levagozim. So the Levush never ba'avera. Most Achronim reject the Levush. The Taz has two mahalchim. Barichas Gedoylo, I think it's Tofresh Mem Tetziv Kon Tetzayin. The Taz brings the Levush, rejects the Levush. And then he writes, just like in Baba Kama Ches, in Kodshim, there's a psul of Nidma. And Nidma is, even if it's not a mean posel, but if it seems like a mean posel, by Kodshim it would be posel. And the Taz says, maybe the same would go for Esrogim. And the Taz rejects that interpretation as well, because he says sometimes an esrog murkav seems just like a kosher esrog, and it's not nidma l'aposel at all. And the maskon of the Taz seems to be a gavaldik chiddush, and he says, because an esrog murkav might be 20% or 30% or 40% or 60% a lemon, then it's choser. And choser pasels. According to this interpretation, it would only be possibly on the first day. But the other days would be kosher, because the kichatama is only relevant the first day. But then he says, how would we know how much percent is lemon, how much percent is an esrog? And maybe the majority of this fruit is lemon, not esrog, and that would be possible all the other days. And that is based on the Tumas Adeshem. Fascinating Tumas Adeshem that is quoted by everyone. Tumas Adeshem writes that it transpired once at Ir Gedoyle LeElokim, and they only had one esrog. And all the shuls, hundreds of people, only had one esrog. And at Rav Paskin, they should take that esrog. Obviously, it was a taimani esrog, a big one, and they should cut it into 6 parts. And each of the 6 shuls should get one piece of the esrog, 1/6. But he writes, you need to be makbed that each piece should be bigger than a sheer esrog, because when you cut a fruit to pieces, it dries out and it shrinks, it becomes smaller. So we need to determine and be confident that after this piece of fruit will dry, it still will have a sheer esrog. And the Tumas Adeshem rejects it, and he said, esrog achoser is when the majority of the pre is intact and part of it is missing. But a piece of an esrog is not an esrog choser. A piece of an esrog is not kosher. So based on the Tumas Adeshem, that esrog choser is kosher only the other days, only if the majority of esrog is intact and just a piece of it is missing. The Taz doesn't call the Tumas Adeshem, but he writes, an esrog murkav is possible because we don't know how much percent is esrog, how much percent is lemon, and therefore maybe it's just a minority esrog, and therefore it would be possible. Kol shar yemei hachag as well. And also he writes, maybe if most of it is lemon, then what is left, which is esrog, is smaller than a shear, and it doesn't have a shear esrog, and there is a shear esrog, and therefore it's possible b'shayim. However, the Taz writes that because the psul of an esrog murkav is somewhat fuzzy, somewhat questionable, therefore, if there's no other, and we should take an esrog murkav without a bracha. So, I think this Taz is a gavaldik chiddush. On all counts, would that be defined as esrog choser? Not for the Taz, we would say choser is only when actually physically part of the esrog is missing. There is a tashbitz. I don't even know where it is. But I remember from 100 years ago that the Shoyle Meshev quotes this Tashbetz extensively, and he likes the Haggadahs. And the Taz differentiates in the sugya of Chotzi Evet, Chotzi Ben Choyren. And he writes there is Harkove Shchenis and Harkove Mizgis. Harkove Shchenis is when two things are just juxtaposed, put together, but it's clearly defined what's this and what's that. But when something is fused in nature, that is different. That is nature. So in Esrog Amurkav, it is very reasonable to accept the Magen Avraham argument. It's not defined as an Esrog, because something that is 50% Esrog is not Esrog. But to say it's an Esrog Chosar, or a Esrog Pochas Mikishir, that would be somewhat interesting. So the Taz relates to this fruit as if it has half this and half that, and therefore maybe what is left of Esrog, of the nature of an Esrog, is Pochas Mikishir, and in any event it would be defined as a Esrog Chosar. So two of Gedolei Poilin are very fascinating in this sugya, as they always are. Questionable, but always fascinating, and that's the Chelkas Yoav, or a Chaim Lamed Beis, the writes in Arichas Gedolah, and the very last piece in Beis Oisa of Rabbi Yosef Engel. So Rabbi Yosef Engel has many, many sforim. He was extremely prolific and a phenomenal gadol. So my late father, Zechrono Levracha, we grew up with Rabbi Yosef Engel. My father's bedside, you know, most people on their bedside have newspapers and journals, and my father's bedside was always Rabbi Yosef Engel. He was infatuated with Rabbi Yosef Engel's sforim. He wrote many sforim, and each of a sefer has a different name. I also wrote many sforim lahavl, but I gave them all the same name because I was afraid that I wouldn't even remember the names of my sforim at some stage in your life when your memory starts fading. And I thought it would be very embarrassing if I wouldn't remember the name of my sforim. So all my sforim have the same name. But the Beis of Engel wrote many sforim, and each has a different name. Beis Oitza is an original sefer. It's an encyclopedic order. But we only have Ois Aleph and part of Ois Beis. I don't know whether he finished the Aleph Beis and the Ksuvim were lost, or he just didn't get that far. I don't know. But the very last paragraph in Ois Aleph, at the end of the Sefer, is Reish Yutes. We'll get to this soon. But the Chelkas Yoav questions the entire approach. Would that be considered chosar? And the Chelkas Yoav writes, in many sugyas, and he quotes some sugyas, we say a concept which we might call greira, that the miut is nigrar achrei harav, and that the doiv determines the nature of something which is actually fused by nature. And we don't say ze lechudei koi v'ze lechudei koi, and it's like two different fruits. So the Chelkas Yoav argues, according to the logic of the Taz, maybe an Esrog Murkav is possible because you're over Hambal Toisef. That's a min chamishi. It is as if you're taking an Esrog and a lemon. And not only arguing to Yotzi Yedei Choiva, maybe that would be an argument why B'Shas Adchak you should never take an Esrog Murkav, because you might be over an Issa B'kum V'asei. And there's a big Machlokes Tanoim. Lagabe Zrikas Dam Al Gabe Mizbeach. Would it be better to be Zorik Dam B'Mokum Sofek and Oiver Ambal Toisef, or to refrain from Zikas Adam and Oiver Ambal Tigra? And the Gemara says better to Oiver Ambal Tigra B'Shev Al Tas and not Bal Toisef B'Kum V'asei. So the Chelkas Yoav doesn't make this purple. This is my addition. So if we say it might be Bal Toisef, then even b'shas adchak, when you don't have an azar, maybe it's better to refrain from mitzvahs dalat minim, which is a mitzvah to say, and not be over an alav bekum v'asei. You might be over bal toisef. It would be extremely unreasonable to say this is bal toisef because it's not a min chamishi. But in the same way, it's somewhat unreasonable to say this is chosar, or it's an esrig pochas mikashir. Either it's an esrig or it's not an esrig. But that is the Taz. And the Taz is one of the greatest poskim, and everybody quotes the Taz. So the three fundamental approaches are Nevda Ba'aveda, which most Achronim reject, Nidma, which the Taz rejects, the Taz, Chosar, Pochas Mikashia. I think the most reasonable approach would be the Mogan Avraham, and the Mishnah Berurah quotes the Mogan Avraham in both sources. It's not defined as an esrog. An esrog murkav would be considered a different mean, and it would not be defined as an esrog. So going back to the early sources, we find three different approaches. The Ramo quoting the son of Maram Padova, that even b'di'evet, it is posur, and there's no point. The same is the opinion of the Halachic. They do not clearly define what is the reason of the psul, and that is left to the Mogan Avraham and other Achronim. We have two tshuvas in the Bach, Kuf Lamed-Hey, Kuf Lamed-Vav. It is a correspondence between the Sma and the Bach. The Bach was machshir ha'esrig murkav. Lechatchila. And he said, if it looks like an esrog, as the Samuna esrog, murkav wouldn't pass it. It is an esrog. And the Sma, quoting Maram Padova, says, no, Masoris v'Yudeinu, even with the evidence also. But the Sma says, when you have no other, then you should noitel b'li brocha. And the Bach, Lemaisa, says, Botlu dati. But the Bach is somewhat more lenient than the others, and he writes, B'mukum de'i efshar ein moichin b'yad. So the Bach seems to be oimed al datoi, that there's no reason to pass al enesek mukab, b'yafar biken. Because his predecessors testified that the Gedolei Tzfas and the Gedolei Italy in the days of Maram Padova said even b'di'evet it's possible. So the Bach says lechatchila one should definitely take another esrog. However, mishas adchak without a bracha. The same is upon a meiros. Chelik Weiss Siman Kuf Ayin Gimel. So Rabbi Yosef Engel, Reishu Tes Beis Oitza Mareches Aleph is fascinating. And like in every other sugya, what's the psil chasa? He argues with the Taz. Lekichatamo, or lekachtem, lekichatamo. A balmum is posel a korban, and we learn that from Tomim. Korban needs to be Tomim. Tomim is mamayit a balmum. In Masechet Menachos and in Masechet Choros, mum pasels only if it's a mum anikar. So Rabbi Yosef Engel argues, what's the difference between Tomim by Karbonis and Lekichat Tamim by Dalet Minim? And Tomim pasels a balmum only if it's nikar. If it's an internal organ that is missing, then korban is kosher, as long as it's not a treifa. Balmum is only mum nikar. So Rabbi Yosef Engel argues the same would go to chosar. Chosar is possible only if it's nikar. We're not going back to the shir I said a few weeks ago. In Hodor and in chosar, to what degree does it need to be obvious? Rabbi Yosef Engel speaks more in the abstract, not how much is boinus is needed, but fundamentally. If a balmum is possible because it's not tomim, and the Gemara says only a mum nikar is a chson in tomim, so he said estek echosef, if it looks like an estek, even it would be choser lefi ataz, but it's not nikar. And then he quotes the Gemara on Choros Daf Mem. So typical of Rabbi Yosef Engel. Choros Daf Mem, the Gemara says nishbar raglo is possible. Why is it possible? When the animal is lying down or crouching down, it's not obvious that its leg is broken, but the Gemara says it can't walk. When it walks, it limps, and that is considered nikar. So Yosef Engel says, even if it's nikah, not obvious when it stands in one place, but if it's somewhat nikah, al yedei dovaracha, when it walks, that is considered nikah. So if the Maram Padav and all the others right, that an Esrog Murkav has some monim and it's not exactly like an Esrog She'eina Murkav, that would be like an animal that is nikah when it's soileah. So it would be a psul. And then Rabbi Yosef Engel writes, Nis yashavti bedati, that even though both halachas are based on tomim, lekichet tama and tomim, maybe there's a difference between chosa and balmum, which should have been obvious in the first place. But Rabbi Yosef Engel writes, both are based on tomim, but not necessarily the same. Chosa doesn't need to be nikah. Mum does need to be nikah. And then Rabbi Yosef Engel writes, I have another reason to pass on an Esrog Murkav. That is based on Menochas Lamed Beis. So Menochas Lamed Beis, the Gemara dashes, Ukshartem le'ois al yudecho, Ukshartem shetei kshiretamo. And the Gemara says, Nikra Retzula Shel Tefillin, could you tie it together? So the Gemara tells the story. Abai have Yosef Kamed Rabbi Yosef. If Selkeru the Tefillah, Omalei Ma'ile Miktarei. Could I just tie it together? Omalei Ukshartem Ksiv, Shetek Shiratama. Rashi says, Kishiesh Oid Kesher, Malvad Kesher Shel Tefillin, it's not Shiratama. So Rabbi Yosef writes, if there's another species besides Esrog, it's not Lekichatama. Just like if there's another kesher, and the Gemara darshans kshiratama, so we have lekichatama, kshiratama, tomim bakarbonos. The Sefta Masechet Sanhedrin, Reb Meir says, kol haTorah kula davar echad. But Reb Yosef Engel, kol haTorah kula davar echad. And you can't abstain from being spoiled. B'chayres daf mem, a behemoth that limps. I forgot even where it's written. Menochas lamed hey, kshira tama, if you tie it tzulis. So but then Rabbi Yosef Engel says, because he was a balavona, he was a Gevaldik Yohan, and then he says, there's a difference, an additional kesher, because there's a din kesher of tefillin. Kesher number 2 is a chson in kshira tama. But maybe a lemon is not a chazon in lakicha tama. Maybe. So anyway, so this is typical of Rabbi Yosef Engel. Going back to the fundamentals. This is a huge...
Why isn't it so that of treifa? Maybe enough of the lemon that would make the Esrog true.
Because even a climb by behem is not a treifa. Even climb by behem is not a treifa.
No, but that amount of lemon, which is not kosher, makes the chosa in the Esrog and the Zayg of some talfas.
We don't find it in treifa by Esrog, but we do find, as we saw in previous Shiur, that we're medama mumim of an Esrog to treifas and kama v'kama halachas. But there's no reason to say that a murkav would make it a treifa even by animals. And murkav is not a treifa. It's a. So, at the end of the day, I think the most reasonable mahalach to disqualify, to pass la Esrog a murkav is it is not considered the Esrog. It's somewhat a different species like the Mughan of Rome and the Mishnah Berurah. So, in days of yore, as I said, the bank was noitel hokam. Many Gedolim say it's questionable, and therefore, when there is no other, you could take it without a brocha and sofet brochas lahokal. And some Gedolim were so convinced that it's possible betachlis, and the early Gedolim, like Maram Padov and Maram Alshech, and they say, even when you have no other. And that's the Mishnah Berurah Tofresh Mem Tes. He says, if it's not the right mean, like a tzaftzaf or ba'arova, tzaftzaf is not an arova, and the Mishnah Berurah says, a murkav is not an esrog. And even b'shas atchak, you shall not take it. In Tofresh Mem Ches Samachei, he writes in Arichas Gedolim, and he quotes the Chsam Sofer. And the Chsam Sofer is in Kuf Pei Gimel. And the Chsam Sofer in Kuf Pei Gimel says, you cannot rely on Simona. Simona Esrog are not, unlike Simona Dogim, which are Gzeis HaKosov, and Simona Oifis, which we find in Chazal, Simona Esrog are not a Gemara, and therefore you cannot rely on Simonim. So we need a Chazaka. And the Mishnah Berurah goes into details. How do you define a Chazaka? So you need to buy from a person that has a Hechsha, needs to be reliable, and you need to know that people could testify in previous generations. So all the Achronim Halacha Lamaisa Pasal that an Esrog Murkav is possible, and even though the back was Makshir. But as we go down in the generations, and I'm just quoting a list of Achronim. We quoted the Levish, the Mugram and the Tas, both Pascal, Pasal, Chsam Sofer, Kuf Pei Gimel. Beis Meir. At the end of Beis Meir, Or Chaim, there's a lengthy tshuva, and the Beis Meir is very harsh, and he is one of those that say, even B'Shas Atrak, we should not take it. Chayodom Kuf Non Beis, Berkei Yosef, Shulchan Harav, twice, both in Tofresh Mem Ches and Tofresh Mem Tes. And the Mishnah Berurah in two different sources. So the Mishnah Berurah goes into great detail, and he brings the Tshuvas Chasam Sofer Kuf Pei Gimel, and the Chasam Sofer says only Yana V'Esoigim would be okay. At the time, those were considered Esoigim that have a Chazaka. So there are two Tshuvas Chasam Sofer Kuf Pei Gimel and Reish Ayin. Reish Ayin, he writes that one cannot rely but on Simonim. Simona Dogim are Mafurish B'Toyre. Simona Oifes, we find Gemoras. Simona Esrog is only throughout the generations, and therefore we cannot rely on Simonim. Dinam Shel Asoigim Kedin of Torah Denechel B'Mesoides. Oise Amokim Yamuchzek Miyomim Kadmoinim Shesogem Einem Alkovim. Kol Asoigim She'eino Miyanava Ein Lekach B'li Ksav Hechsher in reality, going back hundreds of years, thousands of years, how would we know? And I always quote the Gemara, Mishpocha shenitmo nitmo. Ose de leyono v'letayim amzeirem. The Marashdam and the Marshal, 500 years ago, right, that our Kahanim just Cheskes Kuna, and they actually suffix all the Kahanim. And this psak, some Achronim are even makel by Sfeikis regarding Shvuyo, regarding Grusha Lekoyen. So if people might be Merkovim, what should we say about the Soigim? Could anybody be confident? Was what is considered a chazaka, going back as far as we could verify. So, Mishpocha shenitmo nitmo. I actually gave more piskei halacha about people that might be murkav than about the Soigim that might be murkav, because in this modern world, this comes up all the time. And I tell people, don't try to grovel too much. I had many cases in which a family decided to go back and develop a Ilan Yerbs in a family tree. And what they uncovered was devastating. I remember a younger man came to me, Kecheres and Nishba. His wife decided to give his parents a present. So he talked with all the Bobis and all the elders. And then his grandmother's sister, just Masiach Rafimi, told a story that her mother was married to a person. And he gave her a get. And then she married his brother. And all the family is from her second marriage. They're all mamzerim. They're all mamzerim. Told him, you heard this from an old lady. I would have a magic wand and I would be shoylet al sara shichacho, I would make you forget this. But I don't have that magic wand. But I ask that you ever to speak about this to anyone in the world, because that lady doesn't have memories. First of all, she's a woman, she doesn't have memories. And how does she know? She heard it from her mother. Aid mepi aid, mepi isho. So there's no memories. And the mishpochas b'cheskes kashas. I bring this as an example. Is there any way to know an Esrog tree going back hundreds of years, whether it's murkov or not? Like the Mishnah Berurah writes. So today we have Esrog Chazanish, which is based entirely on mysticism. It would be more reasonable to have Esrog Baal Shem Tov than Esrog Chazanish. The Chazanish came to Eretz Yisrael. What could he do? What did he know about Esrog? So we inquired, is there a paradise that the owner is an Elachid? And he found a paradise, the owner is an Elachid, and that owner told him, to the best of his knowledge, as long as he remembers he yavshed the paradise from his father, and we use these as legim. Was muchzak in a murkov, and the Chazanish bought an Esrog. So we say, Kodesh Baruch Hu would never be machshel the Chazanish with an Esrog, a murkav, and therefore that has become the golden
Standard.
What?
Standard.
The golden standard of Esrog. Now Toyses writes, Kama makoyim es in Shas, ena Kodesh Baruch Hu mevit kol aliyot, and dafka b'midat achila. By anything else, and Toyses deals with the Pinchas ben Yoyer, with the greatest Tanoim. We say, ena Kodesh Baruch Hu mevit kol, and dafka b'midat achila. So, but once again, if it's muchzak, it's kosher. It's muchzak, it's kosher.
Taken from the wild was better. The Chazanish took from the wild. It wasn't someone's party, he has to be seimach on the growing. Going to the forest, he found the Esrog tree growing in the wild.
Are you saying a fact that he took an
That Yeshua was covered. One of the versions of the stories, he went to in the wild.
Which is so unlikely. Where did Esrog never grow in the wild? Where do you find the wild Esrog tree? I loved the woods as a child. I never encountered an Esrog tree anywhere in the woods. There's no such a thing as Esrog in the wild. Esrog no longer grow in the wild. So he definitely went to a paradise. He was told there's an Elachid that has a paradise. So the Nefesh Chaya in Kfar Zeitim 150 years ago planted Esrog trees. Where did he take them? Probably he didn't find them in the wild. So that's Din Torah. We rely on Chazak. And if you rely on Chazak, you're on the safe side. Gam im kamishmaya galia. That is the Din Torah. The Ran writes in the beginning of Masechet Psochim, Somcha Torah LaChazakos. You did your best, you were boidek. Even if you have chumetz, it's not an Aveda. Because you did what you could do. Somcha Torah LaChazakos, that's the Lashon of the Ran. So it's not a Issa B'shoigig. It's not a Issa. So when we're dealing with a Chefze especially, it's not an Issa, it's an Esrog kosher. If there's a Chazaka, it's an Esrog kosher. Just like Mishpocha Shenitmo. Mishpocha Shenitmo, Chas v'sholem, Al Tech Gam Harba.
What's the difference between a lav and a asay very often?
What?
When it comes to chazakas help you for lav, and not necessarily they give you an asay also.
Why would there be a difference between a
Because you didn't do the asay.
What?
Because you didn't do the asay. The lav, there's rules for it. What's called the lav, what's not. But asay didn't give you hasn't give you an asay. Didn't do the ma'isa. Did the wrong thing.
I think Chazuk would apply to a lab and an essay, and especially when we're dealing with the kashrus of a chefz. The Chazuk determines that this is considered, it's not the ma'isa, it's the chefz. And if this is muchzak b'kashrus, then it's kosher. Just like Cheskes Kohuna. It's the same as Cheskes Kohuna. And in Ksubas Avchov Dalet, we find the concept of Koyanei Chazaka. And Koyanei Chazaka, according to most Achroinim, are Koyanim Gemurim Lechol Dov, or otherwise, how could we make a Broch on Berchus Kahanim and Pidya Leben? So for Brochus Nalka. So Chazaka is Chazaka.
The Simonim, even though they're not from Chazal, if the Kadmonim 500 years ago said that the Esrog Chazaka have these Simonim, so those would still be significant. So today there's a lot of Zanim. Some Zanim are more shvach on the Simonim, some are better on the Simonim.
Yeah, so I don't want to go into details because this is a huge controversy. The Kloiser Magarebi used to call Moroccan Esrog bananas. He said they're bananas, they're not Esrog. He had a very harsh way of expressing himself. He used to say, let me see the Moroccan bananas. So they're not Esrog. But I think many others were makbedafka to have Moroccan Esrog. So I have every year a Chazanish Esrog and a Taimani Esrog. And many people quote my name that I'm makbed a Taimani Esrog. The only reason I have a Taimani Esrog because Kirschenbaum that gives me an Esrog every year also gives me a Taimani Esrog. So why not? You know,
so how many Esrogim should you have? Two's enough?
Can I get Yud Weiss Shiftei because a Yud Weiss Shorim in Shamayim and every Shah has its own Esrog like the Riyah Kodesh writes about Musa Chafilo.
Is there one to say that the Taimonish Mesiris is a more pure Mesiris?
So some argue that because the Taimanim are maybe the oldest Kehillah that was not uprooted, because all the European Kehillahs were uprooted and devastated and they were always on the go, and in Taiman for maybe 1,000 years, maybe more, some Taimanim argue that even this man Bayesheni, they were Yoshev Koyim, and some argue their Mesiris is a clear Mesiris. But then why don't you daven with the Taimani Nusach? If you think that Taimani Esrog is the best Esrog, then you should try to daven Taimani Nusach, and that would be a tough one, to daven like the Taimanim. I don't know, I think Konan is Chos Ksherim. So I don't know details. I think the Moroccan Esrog is somewhat the new Mesiris. So the Greek Esrog, the Italian Esrogim, those are the Yanav Esrogim. But most Gedoli Yisrael in the last 150 years were Mahada al Esrogei Eretz Yisrael. Now Esrogei Eretz Yisrael might be Yanav Esrogim. The Chabad Esrogim are all the species of Yanav, and they planted them in Eretz Yisrael more than 100 years ago. So Gedolim, Befrat Gedolim Poilen were very Mahada in Esrog Eretz Yisrael because of the Chibov, Peilas Eretz Yisrael. The Bach writes that Peilas Eretz Yisrael have a Kedusha. And when you eat Peilas Eretz Yisrael, you're Miskadesh. Not Tromis and Maisis, but every Pri of Eretz Yisrael. So, at the end of the day, we rely on Chazukah, just as we rely on Chazukah in Psulei Kohol, we rely on Chazukah by Cheskes Kohuna, we rely on Chazukah and Mesiris by Oifis. And in recent years, many Tshuvas were written to be mefakbik on Oifis and on Behemoths, Shash Murkovim throughout the ages. So we don't have any videos from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, how chickens looked in those days, how Esrogim looked in those days. So, Ein Lano Ela Mesiris Aviseinu B'Yadeinu and Chazukas, and we rely on Chazukas just like in any other area of the Torah. And as the Aran makes it clear at the beginning of Psuchim, and I think it's accepted halacha, when you rely on Chazukah, even though maybe scientifically Kamish Ma'agalia, that it is not right, but Kachud Din HaTorah, and you're Yoitzi Yedechoi. What?
The Rav said he's going to speak at the end of the year about Hadas more.
Oh, so the Shus Yankov speaks about Adasim, and he writes that if the Tam Apsul is Mishum Shenev the Ba'aved, it's not Shaykh Be'adasim, because the Isaklayim is only but what's the Rawi Lachila. Adasim aren't Eitz Machal, so there would be no Psul. However, the Shus Yankov writes, but everybody rejects the Tam of the. So if it is because it's not considered an Esrog, the same would be regarding a Dasim. And then he quotes earlier sources that an Esrog is a certain type, a certain species, which is pre-Eitz Hadar. the Torah deals with a type of Pri, which is called Pri Eitz Hadar. And Chazal try to define what is Pri Eitz Hadar. Dor Be'ila Mishana Nishana, Tam Eitz V'Piriyei Shava. So the discussions in Gemara seem to indicate that there's a certain species of Pri. However, Anaf Eitz Avos, Chazal say Avos is Mishulish, so anything that's Mishulish would be considered Avaras. So if we find some kind of a twig that is Mishulish, but it doesn't look like a Hodas at all, would we say Avos? Probably not. So at the end of the tshuva, the Shiur writes we should be makpid on murkav by hadassim as well, even though he does make it sort to differentiate between hadassim and esrog, based on the understanding that the esrog is a certain type, and the Rambam that writes Mesoros V'Yodein Moshe Rabbeinu, but maybe hadassim would be different. But fundamentally, why would it be different? We would probably enough Eitz Avos is a certain type of tree. Just like Eitz Hadar is a certain type of tree. What is the difference between Eitz Hadar and Eitz Avos? It would be the same, and that is also the maskana of the Shiur. That is what I know. Who are the Achronim that?
The Ramah himself, Kuf is Machmir, has Anocha, his Pasha, the Esrog is possible, and Kuf Yudzayin, he says, Hadas Murkav's Kasha.
Where does he write it's possible?
By Esrog, the Chuvas Ramah by Esrog is Kuf Chava. By Hadas,
but I don't think that's a tshuva.
But it's not the Ramah, it's in Chuvas Ramah, it's the Rampad's tshuva, it's in the same. Kuf Yudzayin, it's the Ramah's tshuva, and he says, he's asked, what's the difference between Esrog and Hadas? And he says, this word, he says, the Hadas, the Ovas Tali Rachmana, and anything that's Ovas from Murkav's.
Yeah, but I ask, so if we unless we said there's no such a thing, besides Hadas, and there is no Ovas. And if it's Ovas, that is it. So maybe the reasoning to be machalik, and this is what I think it's a starker story. B'nei Tzodor could be anything, and therefore ein lanu elam esoros of Shlita b'yadeinu. An afetz avos is a species, but maybe the only species that would be mishulosh is the hadas. So it would be somewhat like snape v'kaskeses. This is the semen. Avos is the semen. Our problem would only be if we find something that is mishulash and it wouldn't resemble the hadas at all, then that would be a question.
Writes on Hadas. He says if we did mean the same circum Halachic in Murkab. It seems like they had two types. And then he's going on Misholish, and then afterwards he gets them in Misholish. Even in the Misholish they had two types.
And that is also the Shiur. That's the Miskana of the Shiur.
Seems like he actually had.
Why is it?